My name is Billy, and I need to tell you about the 3 weeks that changed my life forever. It was supposed to be simple: find cheap accommodation near campus, focus on my studies, and graduate without drowning in debt. That's how I ended up at Millfield Hostel, a century-old building that offered the cheapest rates in the city. Looking back now, I understand why the price was so low. Some places are cheap for a reason, and that reason usually involves something no one wants to talk about. I arrived on a gray October afternoon, dragging my worn duffel bag through the entrance of what looked like a respectable old building. The lobby smelled of old wood and cleaning chemicals, with a hint of something else, something stale and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The manager, a thin man with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes, handed me a key to room 237 on the second floor. "Welcome to Millfield," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you'll find your stay memorable." Room 237 was small and cramped, with two narrow beds separated by a nightstand and a single window that looked out onto the building's courtyard. My roommate's belongings were already there: clothes in the wardrobe, books on the desk, personal items scattered around, but I never saw him during the day. The manager had mentioned his name was Marcus, and that he was a quiet student who kept to himself. Perfect, I thought. I wasn't looking for a social experience anyway. The first few days passed normally enough. I attended classes, came back to study, and fell asleep to the sounds of an old building settling for the night. But it was on the fourth night that things began to change. I was lying in bed around midnight, reading a textbook by the light of my small desk lamp, when I first heard them: the whispers. At first, they were so faint I thought it might be students talking in nearby rooms, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices seemed to be coming from inside my own room. The whispers were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Multiple voices, overlapping and urgent, speaking in hushed tones that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out individual words, but there was something desperate about them, something that made every instinct in my body scream that I should leave immediately. I sat up in bed, looking around the dark room, my heart pounding in my chest. "Marcus," I called out softly, thinking maybe my roommate had returned and was talking on the phone. But there was no response, and Marcus's bed remained empty and undisturbed. As the days passed, the whispers became more frequent and more distinct. They would start around midnight and continue until dawn, a constant murmur of voices that seemed to follow me wherever I went in the room. I began to make out individual words and phrases. "He doesn't belong here. Make him leave. This is our place." The voices were filled with anger and resentment, as if my very presence was an offense to whoever was speaking. I tried to rationalize what was happening. "Old buildings make noise," I told myself. "Sound carries through thin walls and old pipes." But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal building noise. These were voices, human voices, speaking directly to me with an intelligence and purpose that no amount of rationalization could explain away. I started sleeping with headphones on, playing music loud enough to drown out the whispers, but somehow they always managed to seep through. It was during the second week that the physical manifestations began. I would come back to my room to find my belongings moved or rearranged, my books scattered across the floor, my clothes pulled from their hangers. At first, I assumed it was Marcus playing pranks, but I began to realize that I had never actually seen my roommate. Not once. I'd heard footsteps in the night, seen evidence of someone else living in the room, but never laid eyes on the person himself. When I asked the manager about Marcus, he looked at me with genuine confusion. Marcus? He repeated, checking his records. Son, you've been assigned to a single room from the beginning. There is no Marcus registered for room 237. The blood drained from my face as I processed this information. If there was no Marcus, then who had been sharing my room? Who did those belongings belong to? And more importantly, who had I been hearing moving around in the darkness? That night, I decided to stay awake and confront whatever was happening in my room. I sat on my bed with my laptop open, pretending to study while secretly observing the empty bed across from me. Around 2 a.m., the whispers began again, but this time they were different, clearer, more focused. Why are you here? They asked. This is my room. This is my place. You need to leave. I watched in horror as the covers on the other bed began to move, as if someone was lying beneath them, tossing and turning in their sleep. Marcus, I whispered into the darkness. Is that you? The movement under the covers stopped abruptly, and the room fell into a silence, so complete it felt oppressive. Then slowly, the covers began to pull back, revealing the impression of a human form in the mattress, but no actual body. It was as if an invisible person was lying there, someone I could sense but not see. That's when I decided to research the history of Millfield Hostel, digging through old newspaper archives and university records. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 years earlier, a student named Marcus Webb had died in room 237 under mysterious circumstances. The official report listed it as suicide, but witnesses described strange behavior in the weeks leading up to his death. Marcus talking to empty air, claiming he wasn't alone in his room, begging invisible entities to leave him in peace. The parallels to my own experience were undeniable and terrifying. Marcus had experienced the same whispers, the same sense of unwelcome presence, the same gradual deterioration of his mental state. But unlike me, he hadn't left. He had stayed until whatever haunted that room had driven him to take his own life. And now, it seemed, his spirit had joined whatever other entities called Room 237 home. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to my room that night with a new understanding of what I was dealing with. The whispers began as soon as I entered, but now they sounded different, more personal, more desperate. Billy, they called my name for the first time. Billy, don't leave us. Stay with us. Be with us forever. I could hear Marcus's voice among the others now, younger and more recent than the rest, pleading with me to remain. As I tried to pack my belongings, the activity in the room intensified dramatically. Books flew off shelves. My clothes were pulled from my hands before I could put them in my bag, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in the air. The door slammed shut behind me with such force that the entire building seemed to shake, and when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge no matter how hard I pulled. Please don't go, Billy. Marcus's voice was clearer now, filled with a loneliness so profound it made my heart ache. I've been alone for so long. We all have. We just want someone to stay with us, to keep us company. It's so cold here, so dark and lonely. If you stay, you'll never have to worry about anything again. You'll be part of us forever. In that moment, I could see them, not clearly, but as shadows and suggestions of human forms scattered throughout the room. They were the remains of students who had lived in room 237 over the decades, each one drawn in by cheap rent and convenient location, each one trapped by the collective loneliness and desperation of those who had come before. They weren't evil, I realized. They were just profoundly, devastatingly lonely, and they had found a way to ensure they would never be alone again. But I also understood that giving in to their pleas would mean joining them in their eternal imprisonment, becoming another voice in the chorus of whispers that would drive the next student to madness. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I grabbed my bag and threw myself against the door with all my might. "I'm sorry," I shouted to the shadows around me. "I'm sorry you're lonely, but I can't stay. I won't become like you." The door suddenly gave way, sending me tumbling into the hallway with such force that I scraped my knees on the rough carpet. Behind me, I could hear the voices rising in a crescendo of despair and anger, but I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, through the lobby, and out into the night air, not stopping until I was several blocks away from Millfield Hostel. I never returned to collect the belongings I'd left behind. I found new accommodation across town, even though it meant working extra shifts at my part-time job to afford the higher rent. When I tried to tell people about what had happened, they looked at me with concern and suggested I see a counselor about the stress of university life. But I know what I experienced in room 237, and I know that Marcus Webb and the others are still there, waiting for the next desperate student who can't afford to be choosy about where they live. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers in the darkness, faint and far away but unmistakably familiar. I think part of room 237 followed me when I left, a reminder of how close I came to joining that chorus of lonely voices forever. I've learned to live with it, but I'll never forget the lesson of Millfield Hostel. Some prices are too low because the cost isn't measured in money, but in something far more precious: your freedom, your sanity, and ultimately your soul. My name is Lily, and what happened to me during my first week in the hostel was the scariest experience of my life. It all started on my very first night, not with anything I could see, but with a dream. That day, I had just moved into an old hostel near my college campus. The building was big but worn down, with paint peeling off the walls and creaky floors that made every step sound louder than it should. My room was small, a living room-style dorm with a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a small window that looked out into the dorm hallway. It was quiet, maybe too quiet for my liking. I unpacked my few things, hoping this would be a peaceful place to start my college life. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but my sleep was not peaceful. I had a strange dream where I was lying in my hostel bed, but the room felt different. It was much colder, and shadows seemed to stretch and move across the walls. Suddenly, I heard whispers all around me, soft, eerie voices calling my name. "Lily, stay. Don't leave." I tried to move or scream, but I was stuck, frozen, like I was trapped inside my own body. Then I saw a shadowy figure in the corner, reaching out toward me with long, thin hands. I woke up with a scream, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark and silent, but the cold from my dream still lingered. I told myself it was just a scary dream, nothing more. I tried to calm down and go back to sleep, but the feeling that something was watching me stayed with me. The next day was busy, trying to get used to the new place and meet other students, but I couldn't stop thinking about that dream. That night, as I sat reading at my desk, I thought I heard a whisper again. It was soft, almost like the wind sneaking through the cracks of the window. I looked around. Nothing was there. Then, out of nowhere, a book on my desk slowly slid off and hit the floor with a loud thud. I jumped, my heart racing. It's probably just an old building, I told myself. But things only got worse. Each night, the whispers grew louder and clearer. They called my name and whispered things like, "Stay with us," and "Don't ever leave." Once I woke up to find my clothes scattered all over the floor, though I hadn't moved a thing. Another night, my chair slowly turned to face the wall by itself. The air in the room got colder and colder, so much that I could see my breath, even though the heater was on high. I felt more and more scared, and I knew something was very wrong. I talked to the hostel warden, hoping he could explain what was happening, but he just looked at me strangely and said, "Old buildings have their own stories. Try not to pay attention to the noises." That didn't help. If anything, it made me feel even more alone. One night was the worst of all. Around midnight, the whispers turned into angry voices, shouting and screaming in a way that shook me to my core. Lamps flickered and went out. Books flew off the shelves, and doors slammed shut with powerful bangs. I saw a dark shape in the corner of the room, moving closer to me. My hands trembled, and I could barely breathe. The voices yelled, "Stay! Stay with us forever." I grabbed my bag and tried to run for the door, but it slammed shut right in front of me. I pulled and pushed the handle, but it was locked from the inside. I was trapped. I felt hands grab at my legs, tugging me back toward the shadows. I screamed, desperate to escape. With all my strength, I slammed my body against the door. It finally burst open, and I fled down the hall, out of the hostel, and into the cold night air. I never looked back. I left everything behind, too scared to even return for my things. Since then, I've never been able to forget those whispers, that cold, the feeling of being watched. Some people say it was my imagination or stress, but I know what I lived through was real and dangerous. If you ever find yourself in a place like that, listen to your gut. Some rooms are haunted not just by ghosts, but by cold loneliness that tries to trap you forever. My name is Tina, and for most of my life, I didn't believe in ghosts or paranormal things. But that all changed after I moved into an old college hostel to finish my degree. I was 27 then, older than many of the other students, but I needed a cheap place close to campus, and this was the best I could find. The hostel building looked ordinary from the outside, but once I stepped inside, something felt off. The walls were cracked and stained, the air smelled stale, and the floorboards groaned under every step. The silence hovered heavily, broken only by distant echoes that seemed to come from nowhere. The warden handed me the key to room 19, a small door at the far end of the second floor. His eyes shifted nervously as he said, "Be careful in there." Room 19 has a history. I smiled awkwardly, thinking it was some creepy joke to mess with new students. I was a grown woman. I didn't believe in haunted rooms or superstition, but from the very first night, I realized something was very wrong. My room was cramped and dim, furnished only with a single bed, a battered wardrobe, and a desk cluttered with leftover papers and stains. The window looked out to a narrow alley where the sun barely reached. I unpacked my bags and tried to imagine this box as home. That night, I fell into a restless sleep that quickly turned into a nightmare. I dreamed I was in the room, but everything around me was darker. Edges blurred, shadows moving like smoke crawling across the walls. Then I heard whispering voices coming from all corners. The words were broken, jumbled whispers at first, but they grew clearer. Tina, stay. Don't leave. I tried to scream or run, but I was frozen in place. Suddenly, a dark hand stretched from the shadows, ice cold to the touch, grabbing my wrist and pulling me toward the darkness. I woke up with a start, sweating, heart racing so hard I thought it would break free. The room was still and quiet, except for a strange chill that made my breath visible in the air. I told myself it was just a bad dream, nerves, or the stress of moving. But the cold didn't leave, and neither did the feeling of being watched. The next day, as I returned from class, I found my backpack unzipped and its contents spilled across the floor. The notebooks, pens, and papers scattered like someone had violently rifled through them. But the window and door were locked tight, and there was no sign of any intruder. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper at the edge of my hearing. Stay here. You belong. It wasn't outside the room. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It was inside. The air in my room felt heavy and colder than any winter night. Clothes inside my wardrobe subtly shifted as if touched by invisible hands. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, but the whispers grew louder every night. Objects began moving on their own. Books fell from the desk while I was sitting just feet away. Papers rustled in piles, though no door or window was open. Once, I saw my chair slowly slip away from the desk and face the wall. The warmth I tried to create with sweaters and blankets never reached deep enough. The cold seeped under my skin, numbing me. When I asked the warden about the room, his face darkened, and he quietly confessed, "Room 19 isn't like the others. No one stays there long. It traps them." He quickly changed the subject when I pressed for details. I wanted to leave, I really did. But with tuition due and no alternative housing, I felt stuck in that haunted cell. One night, the whispers became screams. Furniture rattled violently. The wardrobe slammed open and shut like a beating drum. Dark shapes flickered at the corners of my eyes, always out of focus but deeply unsettling. A chorus of voices chanted relentlessly, "Stay! Forever!" I was frozen, terror gripping every fiber of my being. Shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally across the walls as my mind spiraled towards panic. Something deep inside me told me I couldn't stay here. This room was alive, and it didn't want me gone. The days blurred together after my first real encounter with the true horror in room 19. I tried to hold on to some sense of normalcy, attending classes, forcing myself to eat, answering texts from home, pretending everything was fine. But the truth was, every evening I dreaded returning to that room. I started keeping all the lights on, stacking my few possessions so nothing could be easily moved, and leaving soft music playing, anything to drown out the quiet. But at night, the cold returned, biting and sharp. The whispers began earlier and grew more insistent, sometimes breaking into cries that felt like they came from inside my skull. Objects shifted at will. One evening, I set my course books on the desk and returned minutes later to find them strewn across the floor. My water bottle rolled in slow circles, as if pushed by invisible fingers. I stood there, rooted, watching powerless as my bed sheet was tugged toward the foot of the bed by some force I couldn't see. I started writing everything down in a diary, desperate to find a pattern or some explanation. Flipping back through my entries, dread sank in as I realized the activity was intensifying. The incidents weren't just random, they followed a rhythm, growing wilder with each sunset. Friends noticed I scarcely left my room outside class hours. Dark rings formed under my eyes, and my skin looked almost gray in the mirror's dim reflection. At lunch, I caught myself flinching at even the gentlest touch or the drop of a fork. One cold night, fleeing the thick gloom of my room, I wandered the hostel's ground floor halls and ended up by the old staff office. To my surprise, the warden was awake, hunched over a pile of ancient logbooks. He barely glanced up as I approached, but I pushed past my embarrassment. I needed answers. Has anyone ever complained about room 19 before? I asked. My voice shook. He stared into his mug before answering, "That room's been trouble since before I worked here." He hesitated, then, "In the old files, plenty of students have asked to switch out. Some left and never came back. Some just faded." I pressed him for more, but he shut his book and retreated out back to smoke. I sat for a while, listening to the wind, thinking of shadows dancing in empty rooms. Returning to my floor, I saw a faint shape reflected in the hallway window for a split second. A dark mass, like smoke in human form, there and gone in a blink. My hands shook as I let myself back into the freezing room. That night, instead of whispers, I heard a girl's voice, panicked, sharp, and pleading. "Please, don't shut me in here. Help!" The cry bounced off the walls, joined by angry mutters and pained weeping. I scrambled for my phone, but the screen glitched, showing nothing but static. The air pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. I tried to hide under the covers, but the blankets were yanked away. The wardrobe door swung open, hitting the wall with a thud. I saw a pale face inside its darkness. Eyes wide, mouth stretched in a soundless scream. My hands covered my ears, but it didn't help. The room wanted to punish me for trying to ignore its suffering. In the early dawn, when the activity faded, I found scratches on my arms, 3 thin, red lines, as if fingernails had pressed into my skin while I slept. I was determined to fight back. The next day, armed with an old camera and my phone, I snapped pictures of every odd movement and audio recordings of the whispers. But the files were always corrupted. Photos, nothing but blackness. Recordings full of white noise. I tried to show friends, but they just saw a tired, scared girl talking about ghosts. Research became my only comfort. In the campus library, I dug through old yearbooks and newspaper archives. What I found made my skin crawl. A string of accidents and disappearances tied to room 19, dating back decades. One entry detailed a girl named Rita, who'd reportedly locked herself in the room for days, rambling about voices in the walls. She was never seen on campus after that semester. Another report spoke of a fire on the floor 30 years ago, where 2 students tried to cleanse room 19 after a week of terrifying activity. The fire started in the wardrobe and left the walls stained black in places where later generations would try to paint over the truth. I even found stories of light bulbs shattering, voices whispering in the bathrooms, and entire groups of students refusing to stay on the second floor after nightfall. That night, I stared at the wardrobe, running my fingers over the cracks in its paint, convinced the heart of the haunting rested somewhere inside. My sleep was a mess of nightmares and half-waking hallucinations, shadowy figures staring at me with hollow cheeks, cold hands grabbing my legs as I tried to run. My exhaustion became dangerous. I barely remembered to eat, skipped classes, and jumped at every small sound. I wrote to my family but could never bring myself to admit the truth. I am scared all the time. I can't sleep. I don't feel safe. The breaking point came after a week of relentless terror. The shadows no longer waited for nightfall. One afternoon, as I sat frozen at my desk, the lamp fizzled and burst, plunging me into dimness as the whispers circled like vultures. Sheets tore themselves from the bed. My entire wardrobe shook and toppled forward with a boom, nearly pinning me to the ground. Screaming, I ran out and down the hall. The doors of every room slammed shut as I passed. I pounded on the warden's office, but no one answered. When I returned, panting and terrified, I saw scrawled words in the dust on my mirror. "You can't leave." I really tried. Suitcases wouldn't stay packed. Zippers jammed. Clothes vanished, and my bag was heavier every time I picked it up, as if the room itself were gripping my things. My key twisted in the lock, refusing to turn. Sometimes, when I opened the door to run, it would slam shut in my face, nearly crushing my fingers. My sleep disappeared. I wandered the halls at night, exhausted, only to find myself somehow always back in front of room 19. I kept hearing my name whispered and sometimes saw myself reflected in places I hadn't been standing. With nowhere else to turn, I started researching cleansing rituals, desperate for any hope. I tried salt in the doorway, scatterings of rice, even burning sage I'd ordered online. Nothing changed. If anything, the room seemed angrier. The air pressed heavier, bruises showed up on my wrists, and the voices grew sharp and mocking, telling me I was never leaving. One stormy night, the walls felt like they were closing in. Thunder shook the hostel as lightning flickered through the window, painting the shadows darker than ever. The wardrobe creaked open again, and swear to God, I saw a hand, pale as milk and covered in scratches, reach out. I bolted into the hall, only to be stopped by a freezing wind, howling out of nowhere, and doors slamming on all sides as the whispers turned to screeches. That night, I dreamt of falling over and over into a chasm of shadows, hands tugging me down, voices screaming my name. When I finally woke, it was nearly noon. My room was a wreck, furniture overturned, clothes torn and scattered, and new, angry scratches on the wardrobe's inside door. "Stay," written again and again in jagged letters. Every moment, alone in that building, was a fight against despair. Something in room 19 didn't want its guests to leave. It was growing stronger by the day. And the worst part? I was starting to feel weaker, almost as if the room was stealing my energy, pressing its misery into my thoughts. Sometimes, I struggled to remember my own past, memories replaced by flashes of faces I'd never seen, all begging for a chance to escape. I had become just another trapped voice, swallowed by the whispers.